Ended the engagement right there at the rehearsal dinner, in front of 43 people. I stood up, looked my girlfriend of 4 years in the eye and said, "We're done." Then I walked out with my mother. People thought I lost my mind that night. By the following morning, they understood why. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started. Not the rehearsal dinner. Not even when I first noticed something was off about her. It started on a Tuesday in October, 3 years ago, when my mother drove 4 hours from Harlan County, Kentucky, to meet the woman I told her I was going to marry. My name is Dale. I'm 58 years old. I spent 31 years working as a heavy equipment operator for a road construction company out of Lexington. I'm not a wealthy man. I own a modest house, a reliable truck, and a savings account that I guard like it's made of something precious. Because it is. Every dollar in it came from early mornings and late nights and joints that don't bend the way they used to. My mother, Winifred, is 79. She still lives on the 12-acre property outside Harlan where I grew up. She raised me and my brother alone after our father passed when I was 11. She grew a kitchen garden, kept a few chickens, sewed alterations for neighbors, and somehow made sure we never went hungry and never missed a day of school. When I was 30, she took out a small loan and bought the adjacent 4 acres when the Henson family sold. She paid it off in 6 years, every penny from her own hands. She is the most capable, dignified woman I have ever known in my life. Which is why what happened at that rehearsal dinner cut me so deep I'm still finding pieces of it today. I met Christine at a home improvement convention in Louisville in the spring 4 years ago. She was working a vendor booth for a high-end kitchen cabinetry company. Polished, well-spoken, sharp sense of humor. We traded numbers and started talking, and within a few months we were serious. Christine was 44, twice divorced, no children. She had an apartment in Lexington, a good sales job, and the kind of social confidence that I, a quieter man by nature, found impressive. Her friends were professional types, consultants, real estate brokers, a few lawyers. They went to wine bars and talked about trips to Portugal and Scottsdale. I didn't fit perfectly into that world, but Christine always seemed to want me there, so I tried. For 2 years, things were genuinely good between us. The problems started small. A comment here, a look there. Nothing I could put my finger on directly. The first time she met my mother was at Christmas year 2. We drove down to Harlan, and my mother had cooked for 2 days straight. Country ham, soup beans, cornbread, a sweet potato casserole she only made for special occasions. The house smelled the way it always smelled in winter, wood smoke and vanilla and something baking. Christine sat at the table, smiled at everything, and ate almost nothing. On the drive back to Lexington, she said, "Your mom is sweet, very country." I let that one go. The next visit was Easter. My mother had been dealing with a waterline problem that week and had been out in the yard helping the plumber dig up the old pipe. Her hands were still roughed up from it when we arrived. Christine shook her hand and then, when my mother turned away, made a face at me, like she'd touched something unpleasant. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I was not reading too much into it. I proposed to Christine on her birthday in September of the following year. Took her to a nice restaurant in downtown Lexington, got down on one knee. She cried, said yes. The whole room clapped. It was a good night. My mother called me the next morning to congratulate us. She told me she was happy if I was happy. There was something careful in her voice, the way a woman who loves you too much to lie to you sounds when she's trying not to say the things she's actually thinking. I noticed it. I didn't ask about it. We set the wedding for the following November. Venue in Lexington, about 160 guests, Christine's parents, her father Edward, a retired bank vice president, and her mother Lorraine, very much still performing the role of bank vice president's wife, were heavily involved in the planning. They were not unkind to me exactly, but they had a way of looking at me that reminded me of how you look at a piece of furniture that doesn't quite match the rest of the room. The rehearsal dinner was the night before the wedding, held at a private dining room at a restaurant Christine's mother had chosen, the kind of place with cloth napkins folded into little birds and a sommelier who appeared silently at your elbow. 43 people. Both families. The wedding party. My mother had driven up that afternoon. She brought a covered dish, her sweet potato casserole, because that is what my mother does when she goes somewhere. You show up with something. She'd also worn her good dress, the navy blue one she bought for my brother's college graduation 12 years ago. She looked lovely. She always looks lovely to me. We were about 40 minutes into dinner when it happened. My mother had stood up to use the restroom. She had to pass behind Christine's end of the table. As she passed, she lightly touched Christine's shoulder, just a passing touch the way people do, and said, "I'm so glad we're going to be family, sweetheart." Christine did not look up from her conversation. Then, when my mother had moved past, Christine leaned toward Lorraine, her mother, and said something. She didn't whisper. She used the voice people use when they've stopped caring who hears. She showed up with a casserole dish. Like this is a potluck. She laughed a little. I keep forgetting Dale is basically a different species. The table went quiet the way rooms do when something uncomfortable has just been said too loudly. My mother had just pushed open the door to the hallway. I don't know if she heard it. I still don't know. She never told me. But I heard it. I heard every word. I sat there for about 30 seconds. Maybe less. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger exactly. It was more like the sudden absence of something I'd been carrying without realizing, a weight I'd been making excuses for, explaining away, choosing not to look at directly. It just dropped. I stood up. I picked up my glass, still had wine in it, and I set it back down because I didn't want to do anything dramatic. I walked to Christine's end of the table. She looked up at me with a puzzled smile, like she expected me to say something sweet. "I heard what you said." The smile stayed but changed shape. "Dale, don't." I kept my voice low. Not angry. Just done. "I need you to understand that the woman who just walked past you raised me alone. She worked every day of her life so I could have a chance. She drove 4 hours today to celebrate something that's important to me." I paused. "And you just said she's a different species." "I didn't mean." "I know you didn't think I could hear you." Christine's father started to say something. I looked at him. He stopped. I walked to the hallway. My mother was coming back from the restroom. She looked at my face and knew immediately that something had happened. Mothers always know. "Get your purse," I said. "I'm taking you to dinner. A different one." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Give me a second," went back to the dining room, picked up her casserole dish, and walked out with me. We went to a diner 2 miles away and ate hot turkey sandwiches and pie and talked for 3 hours. It was one of the best nights I've had in years. My phone did not stop buzzing the entire time. Christine called 7 times. Her mother called twice. My brother called once. I answered that one. He said, "Good. I've been waiting for you to see it," which told me that other people had seen it long before I did and nobody had wanted to say anything. That's a particular kind of loneliness. Being the last one to understand something about your own life. I sent Christine a text that night that said, "I'm not coming tomorrow. I'll be in touch about logistics." She called immediately. I didn't answer. The next morning I called my friend and attorney, a man named Pete, who I've known since we were both in our 20s. I told him what happened. He said, "You want to get ahead of this." I did. The wedding venue had a 48-hour cancellation clause. We were inside it by a few hours. The deposit, $30,200, was non-refundable. I accepted that. The catering had a different clause, and Pete helped me navigate a partial refund about 60%. The florist was understanding when I told her there'd been a family emergency, and it wasn't entirely untrue. In total, I lost about $6,800 in non-refundable costs. I wrote that off as the price of information. What I'd learned about Christine was worth considerably more than $6,800. What I didn't know yet, what I found out about 3 weeks later, was what my mother quietly told me over the phone one evening. It turned out Christine had called my mother twice. The week after the rehearsal dinner, my mother, being who she is, had answered. The first call, Christine asked my mother to talk some sense into me. My mother told her that she didn't involve herself in her children's decisions. The second call, Christine's tone had shifted. She told my mother that I was throwing away a good thing and that my mother's influence over me wasn't healthy. Then she said something that my mother, even in the retelling, paused before repeating. That a man in my financial position couldn't afford to be this sentimental. My mother said, "I see," thanked her for calling and hung up. She hadn't told me about those calls until 3 weeks later because she hadn't wanted to upset me further. That's who she is, absorbing things to protect the people she loves. When she told me, I was sitting on her porch in Harlan with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. "Mama," I said, "you should have told me. You needed a little peace first," she said. We sat for a while. The garden was putting out its last tomatoes. Some of the leaves had started to turn. Then she said something I've thought about many times since. "Dale, that woman didn't look down on me because I'm poor. We've never been poor, we've just been careful. She looked down on me because she didn't understand the difference between having things and being something." I didn't have a response to that. I just nodded. Here's the part of the story that surprised me. About 2 months after the split, I got a call from Pete. He'd heard something through a mutual contact, a real estate attorney he knew on the east side of Lexington. It turned out that Christine's father, Edward, had been in conversation with a property developer out of Nashville who was quietly acquiring land parcels in Harlan County and the surrounding area. There was a highway expansion project that had been in quiet planning stages, not yet public, that would significantly increase the value of land along a particular corridor. My mother's property sat directly on that corridor. The 12 acres she'd tended for 40 years, plus the 4 she'd bought with her own savings, 16 acres total, were in the middle of a projected acquisition zone. Conservative estimates put the potential value, once the project went public, somewhere north of $800,000, possibly more depending on how the developer negotiations went. Edward had known about this. Pete couldn't prove that Christine had known, but the timeline of when she'd gotten serious with me and when Edward had first started looking at land maps for that project were uncomfortably close together. I'm not a man who goes looking for the worst in people. I gave Christine 4 years of good faith. But sitting with Pete in his office, looking at those dates, I felt something cold and clear move through me. Whether Christine had calculated everything from the start, or whether she'd simply absorbed her father's thinking along the way. Either way, the result was the same. My mother was not a person to her. My mother was an obstacle, or a means to an end, someone to be managed until the real transaction could take place. I told my mother all of it. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Well, it's a good thing you got your ring back." She had not changed. That was the thing. All of this, all of what Christine thought she understood about our situation, and my mother was sitting there in her kitchen with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, completely unchanged. We consulted with a land attorney that Pete recommended, a woman named Helen who specialized in rural property transactions. Helen was direct and thorough. She laid out my mother's options clearly. The highway project was going to be publicly announced within the year, she estimated. At that point, my mother would have significant leverage in any negotiation. My mother decided to wait. 14 months later, the announcement came. Harlan County Courier ran it on a Thursday. By Friday, my mother had 3 calls from developers. She sold 11 of her 16 acres, keeping 5 around the house itself, to a development group for $740,000. Helen negotiated the terms. It was clean and fair. My mother paid off a home equity line she'd taken out 5 years earlier for a roof replacement. She set aside money for any medical expenses that might come up. She gave my brother and me each a meaningful sum. Enough to matter, not so much that we get foolish about it. And she established a small scholarship fund at the high school in Harlan in memory of my father for students going into vocational or trade programs. That last part was entirely her idea. The day she told me about the scholarship, she was standing at her kitchen counter cutting up a chicken, same as she'd done 10,000 times before. She said it so casually you'd have thought she was telling me she'd switched brands of dish soap. "I set up a little fund at the high school," she said, for kids going into the trades, named it after your daddy. I had to look out the window for a minute. As for Christine, I don't carry bitterness about it. I did for a while, I won't lie. But bitterness is a weight, and I've carried enough weight. I know that she and her father had conversations I'll never be fully certain of, and that somewhere in those conversations my mother's land factored in. But I also know that Christine looked down on my mother before she knew any of that. The calculation came later. The contempt was original. That matters to me. That's the thing I think about, not the money, not what was almost taken. The way Christine leaned toward her mother at that table and said what she said. The fact that she didn't think it was a meaningful thing to say. The fact that 43 people went quiet and my mother walked back into that room not knowing exactly why. I don't have a partner right now. My brother thinks I'm too particular. Maybe, but I watched my mother carry 16 acres and a hard life with absolute grace, and I figure whatever standard that sets for who I let into my world, it's probably the right one. My mother turned 80 last spring. We had a party at her house. Her garden, her porch, paper plates, and that sweet potato casserole she brings everywhere. My brother's kids ran through the yard. Neighbors she'd known for 50 years came by. At some point in the evening, I was standing at the edge of the garden, and she came and stood next to me. The evening light was coming in low from the west. Everything was warm and green and quiet except for the kids. She said, "You happy, Dale?" I told her I was. "Good," she said. "You happy, Dale?" I told her I was. And then she went back inside to cut the cake. That's it. That's the whole story. A rehearsal dinner, 43 people. One sentence that ended 4 years and opened my eyes to what I'd been overlooking. A mother who handled all of it with more dignity than I could have managed. A piece of land that turned out to be worth more than anyone in that restaurant dining room knew. In more ways than one. I'm glad I stood up that night. I'd do it again in a breath. I've thought a lot about what made that night at the rehearsal dinner the turning point. Not just for my relationship with Christine, but for the way I see people now. The way I see myself. Here's what I've come to understand. Contempt doesn't appear overnight. It builds slowly, in small moments you choose to overlook. The face she made at my mother's roughed-up hands at Easter. The word country dropped like a quiet verdict on the drive home from Christmas. Every one of those moments, I made a choice. I told myself I was being reasonable, giving her the benefit of the doubt. What I was actually doing was teaching her that my silence had no cost. That's on me, not on her. When a person shows you who they are, the question isn't whether to believe them. The question is whether you have the courage to act on what you see. I didn't. Not for 2 years. I kept rearranging the evidence until it fit a story I preferred. That's not love. That's just a more comfortable kind of blindness. What finally broke through wasn't logic. It was watching my mother walk past that table with her hand gently on Christine's shoulder, meaning nothing but warmth by it, and hearing Christine reduce her entire life, every early morning, every sacrifice, every acre of land she'd earned, down to a punchline for her mother's benefit. That's when something in me went very still. There's a kind of clarity that only comes when you stop negotiating with yourself. It doesn't feel like anger. It feels like finally seeing the room with the lights on. My mother has never once asked to be recognized for what she's carried. She just carried it. That's what real strength looks like. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that shows up every day and does the work quietly and doesn't require an audience. Christine's world was built entirely around audience. What people saw, what rooms she was in, what the tablecloths looked like. My mother's world was built around what actually holds. The land turned out to be worth more than any of them knew. But that's not the point I keep coming back to. The point is that my mother knew what she had without needing anyone to tell her. She wasn't waiting for a developer's appraisal to understand her own worth. That's the kind of self-knowledge that takes a lifetime to build, and it can't be faked, and it can't be bought, and people who look down on others usually don't have it. What happened to Christine's father wasn't something I planned or wanted. It was simply the result of a long chain of choices. Choices to treat people as instruments. to see a woman's life's work as an asset to maneuver around rather than a thing to respect. Those choices have weight. They land somewhere eventually. I'm 58 years old. I don't have time for the kind of love that comes with conditions I have to pretend not to notice. The standard my mother set, not by lecturing me, but just by living the way she lives, is the only one I know how to use anymore. If there's anything I'd want someone to take from this, it's simple. Pay attention to how a person treats someone they think doesn't matter. That's not a small thing. That's everything.